What are the steps you need to take to make sure you get an amazing cabin on your next cruise? Hi, I'm Gary Bembridge, and this is another of my tips for travelers. A lot of people tell me they're not that bothered about the cabin they get when they go on a cruise because they just use it to sleep in or to get ready to go out. However, that all changes when people have a terrible cabin experience. So I want to talk about the 5 steps you need to take to ensure that you get cabin heaven, not cabin hell. The first step is to book a fare which allows you to choose a specific cabin rather than a guaranteed cabin fare. So what's the difference between the two? If you book a guaranteed cabin, what that means is you're simply buying a grade. So you might say, I want an inside cabin, an ocean view, a balcony, or a suite. The cruise line then decides which specific cabin to allocate you, and they normally allocate that quite close to the cruise going once they know which cabins are available. So you have no say over the specific cabin in that grade that you're going to get. If you book a fare that allows you to choose a cabin, it will often be a slight premium to a guaranteed cabin, but the premium is not always that great. However, you then can choose a very specific cabin. So if you want to make sure that you get a great cabin, choosing a fare where you choose the cabin is always going to give you a greater chance of getting a great cabin. Remember, with a guaranteed cabin fare, the cruise line will allocate you a cabin and you have no say over how good or bad or where that cabin is going to be. And so the second step then, once you have control over choosing cabins, is to look at the deck plans of a ship either online or in the brochure or by talking to your cruise agent, and focus on cabins that are mid-ship. So this is in the middle of the ship. A couple of advantages to that. First of all, midships means that you're always going to be close to the various activities or the facilities. You're not at the front of the ship or the back of the ship, so you don't have those long distances to go. So you'll normally find that it's a great location to get to the various facilities wherever they are on the ship. But secondly, and probably more importantly of all, is this is where you're going to have the least amount of motion. So if you're worried about seasickness or motion sickness, being in the middle of the ship is the best part to be, because when a ship moves, and it moves on the axis with the midship being the midpoint. So as the ship moves up and down, the middle stays pretty constant and the front and the back of the ship move the most. So you're going to have the least amount of motion there. Also, if you are particularly concerned about seasickness, the lower down you go in the ship, also the least amount of motion. Ironically, the highest grades of cabins, which are the suites, tend to be very high up on the ship, and that's also where you're likely to have more motion. So certainly focus on midships, and if you're concerned about motion sickness, also think about the lower level as you start to look at cabins. That's the second key step to take. The third step and the third tip is probably the most important of all of these tips, and it's a very simple tip. When you look at a cabin, look at the deck plans, and then look for cabins which are surrounded on all sides by other cabins. So you want cabins above you, you want cabins below you, you want cabins to either side of you, and ideally also cabins opposite you. If you don't have cabins opposite you, make sure you know what is going to be opposite you. Now, the reason for that is you're then buffered from noisy venues. This is probably one of the most critical things to do, is being surrounded by cabins. The worst cabins I've ever had are when the cabin is above, below, or next to a venue or a place that generates a lot of noise or vibration or some kind of disturbance. Look at the deck plans and make sure if any of these kind of venues are opposite you, above you, below you, or near you. So look out for things like the nightclub, bars which have live music. If you're directly under the pool deck, you'll find that you can get really disturbed by perhaps deck parties, but even more importantly, people scraping and moving around the deck chairs. I've been in amazing cabins before underneath the pool deck, and every morning I've been woken up really early as the crew starts moving around the lounges to set up the pool deck. And again, at the end of the day, if they might be clearing it for a deck party. Other places to avoid are above, below, or next to the theatre, because you'll find there's production shows, loud music, and that can go on at all sorts of hours of the day. When you look at the deck plans and there's nothing showing there, also figure out if the kitchens are there. I have lots of stories of people who've been disturbed at all hours of the day and the night with the kitchens. Bear in mind, a lot of those kitchen operations can be 24 hours a day as they prepare food, can be very, very noisy. Another thing to look for is those ships which have a big central promenade and cabins overlooking those. Also bear in mind, they can be quite noisy because a lot of those will have parties in the central atrium or parades, and it can get quite noisy. So a lot of people I know that have stayed in those cabins, they have often used things like white noise devices to try and just muffle out some of the bass sound and the sound of some of the parties going on. Another area that I've been advised to avoid, actually by crew on a ship, is in the front of the ship, in the bow of the ship, if it's quite a small cruise ship and you're near the anchor. So I was on an expedition cruise on quite a small ship, and they'd put some of the expedition team right in the front of the ship because that was very noisy, because the ship would be mooring, letting down the anchor at early hours of the morning, and that noise was very disruptive for people trying to sleep early in the early hours of the morning. Basically look out for anything on a cruise ship where there's likely to be lots of concentrations of people and noise. So absolutely critical, very simple. When you book a cabin, make sure you're surrounded on every single side by other cabins. And if there's not a cabin opposite you, double check what is opposite you to make sure it's not one of those big noise areas. My fourth tip is one that I'm a little bit obsessed about, and that's when you do book a cabin. So if you've done all the things so far, don't ruin it by booking a cabin with an interconnecting door. Now, of course, if you're traveling with people and you do want an interconnecting door, that's a very different story. However, an interconnecting door could be a source of a lot of disruption for you because they're not that soundproof. So if you have neighbors next door that like to party or play the television really loud when you're trying to sleep, you'll find that can be very, very disruptive. So if you are going to travel by yourself and you're not traveling with family or friends and you want to be interconnected, make sure when you look at those deck plans or you're booking through your agent, check that there's no interconnecting door, because you could have done all of these other tips, have a great cabin, great location, surrounded on all sides, and disrupted by interconnecting door. And I have been on a couple of cruises where the people next door have been really disruptive, and it's really kind of put a dampener on the cruise because you've been woken up late at night with them partying or whatever. So it's a very simple thing to do, but double check you don't have an interconnecting door unless you absolutely need one because your kids are next door or there's friends or family and you want to be able to do that. Now, my next tip might sound a little bit crazy, but it's also a really important one. Once you've gone to all of the bother of going through these steps, one of the things I really recommend you do is refuse an auto upgrade. So when you book, you're often asked either to tick a box if you're booking online, or your agent will ask you, do you want to accept an auto upgrade? Now, the reason for saying no is you have no say over that upgrade. So if you've said yes to an auto upgrade and the cruise line moves you from your inside cabin to an ocean view or an ocean view to balcony or whatever, they again decide which cabin you move to. And it's extremely unusual. In fact, I don't know any cruise line that does it, although you may have had that experience. But normally the cruise line will just allocate you a new cabin and you cannot go back. You cannot refuse that upgrade. So you might find yourself put into a theoretically better cabin, but it's next to a noisy venue, it has an interconnecting door, it's a bad location, it's the front of the ship, the back of the ship, or whatever. So one of the things I always do is I refuse an auto upgrade. I focus on finding a cabin that I'm really happy with, and I don't accept an auto upgrade because I have no say over what cabin I'm going to get. So you could go from what is your cabin heaven into your cabin hell, even though it's theoretically a better cabin. I have a whole separate video about the whole minefield of upgrades. So if you want to know more about upgrades and when it could help or not help, take a look at that video and discover a lot more around how to navigate the whole area of upgrades. But my main tip is don't take the auto upgrade. People keep telling me that the cabin is not that important. It's just a place to sleep and get ready to go out on excursions or whatever. That all changes when they have a terrible cabin experience. And I have hundreds of people telling me that they've had terrible experiences on a cruise. It's ruined their cruise because they didn't spend time choosing the right cabin. You're going to spend more time in your cabin than anywhere else on the cruise. You know, even if you're only sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night because you're partying, if that 4 or 5 hours is a terrible night's sleep, you're not going to have the energy to then keep on partying and going out. So really focus on these 5 steps to ensure that you get a great cabin and have a great cruise. I have loads more cruising tips, loads more cruising advice in videos. Please watch many more of those.